My name is Joey Lindstrom. I'm with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition out of DC. And I'm really excited for today's event. This is the Madison event for the Our Homes, Our Voices National Housing Week of Action. It started yesterday and runs through the end of this week on July 29th. We're doing an action because what we've seen this year is a lot of people stepping up and resisting some really negative things happening in Washington, D.C. Many of you are familiar about the March on Climate Change, the March for Science, the Immigration March. This is what we're doing sort of as a response. And what we've done is we've decided to set it up as a network of events throughout the country. We have 54 events taking place in cities throughout the United States, everywhere from Alaska to Miami. And we also have some national events that are going to be really great as well. Today's speakers will include myself, Dane County Supervisor Heidi Wegleiter, many of you know as a leader in housing on the county board, and similarly Alderman Maurice Cheeks, who's here with us, and Dane County Housing Authority's Executive Director Rob Dick will be here to talk about how some of these cuts are going to play out for the agencies that really use federal dollars. First, I'm going to introduce myself, and I put this slide up in the front today partly because I forgot my business cards, they're not on the table. Secondly, because if any of you are taking photos or tweeting about what we're doing today, I want you to use that hashtag. Because ultimately what we're trying to do with Week of Action is making sure that everybody who's participating is feeling connected with what's going on throughout the country. So if you didn't get a chance to take a look as you were coming in, we have a lot of handouts on the table at the side of the room. I also just put down a sign-in sheet, and that sign-in sheet will be important so that when we want to take action after today's presentation, we know how to get in touch with you and that we have all of your contact information. So that will be shared with some of the organizers of the event today, and then we'll also put it into our email call to action list at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So in addition to our speakers, I really want to thank Brenda Conco for helping me put together today's event, as well as the various organizations that promoted the event through their email lists and through their networks, the Home Services Consortium of Dane County, the Dane County Democratic Party, the South Central Federation of Labor, as well as Progressive Dane, and the Affordable Housing Action Alliance. And thanks, of course, to the South Central Federation of Labor for letting us use the room today. So let's get started. We're doing a National Housing Week of Action, but before we get to that, I always, at the beginning of any presentation I do, I start with a couple of quick facts. The first one is that everyone needs to know that homelessness as it exists today in America is relatively new. As recently as 1974, there was no homelessness in America. If you think about all of the agencies that you volunteer at, that you work with, that you're familiar with in Dane County that are working on these issues, they all started in the 80s or in the early 90s. In 1974, we still had people working minimum wage jobs and not getting enough hours. We had people suffering from addictive disorders or fleeing domestic violence. We had people with physical disabilities, and all of those people had places to live. So what's the difference, you might ask? The difference is the amount of affordable and available housing we have for extremely low-income households. In 1974, we had a surplus. Today, we have a shortage of 7.4 million homes for that income group. And in Wisconsin, that shortage is 123,516, right? So homelessness is a choice. It's a policy choice made by elected leaders, and it's a choice that's supported by voters who continue to send elected leaders to Congress without insisting on a solution to homelessness. So our National Housing Week of Action is about providing the housing that's needed for extremely low-income households throughout our country. And it's needed, as you can see on my graphic right here, only 1 in 4 people who qualify for HUD assistance actually receive it. Only 1 out of 4. Many people have this perception that there are a lot of handouts in housing. You know, we've got benefits for people who are low income. What about people who are middle income? 1 out of 4 low income people who qualifies for housing assistance gets it. Compare that to higher income Americans who get the mortgage interest deduction. 1 out of 1 who is eligible gets to receive it, gets the entitlement. The mortgage interest deduction, which is greater in its amount than the entirety of the HUD budget, goes 85% of the benefit to households with incomes above $100,000. So the next time somebody's telling you people who need federal assistance for their housing should have to take a drug test, go ahead and say that's fine. We should make sure everyone who's getting mortgage assistance takes a drug test. All right, so One thing I have on this slide is about our national events. We're having a Capitol Hill rally on Wednesday of this week with speakers such as Representatives David Price, Charlie Crist, Sheila Jackson Lee. But we're having a calling day on Thursday, July 27th. And I put up the phone numbers for Senator Johnson's and Baldwin's office with the names of their housing staff people, as well as for Representative Bocan. So if you're on our email list and you get our calls to action, you can get that information later next week. Otherwise, feel free to take it down and I can put it back up in just a little bit. Some key stats about Madison. Madison metro area is 88,437 renter households. The 2-bedroom housing wage, what you have to earn to afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent, is $18.54. That's more than $4 above the average renter wage, but we all know that lots of extremely low-income households make the minimum wage. If you're making the minimum wage, you'd have to work 102 hours to afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. In Wisconsin's 2nd Congressional District...
That's hours per what?
Hours per week, excuse me. 102 hours per week. Yes, that's a fair, that doesn't matter. Wisconsin's 2nd Congressional District, we see that 26% of all renters are paying more than 50% of their income for rent. That's what's called being severely cost burdened. And when we talk about extremely low income households, it's 79% paying more than 50% of their income for rent. And that's a shortage in this district of 22,000 homes for ELI renters. Okay, so let's talk about the federal budget. And let's talk about how bad it really is. It's easy to feel despair, especially when you're looking at what's happened in the president's budget request. And President Trump's budget request this year was the most austere and bold cuts that we've seen since President Reagan's first budget in the 1980s, right? Now everybody likes to say, don't worry about the president's budget, the final budget's going to come from Congress, it doesn't matter what the president's budget says. Not true, because the president's budget sets the tone and the goalpost. Because when I did this same presentation a few days ago at the Home for Everyone conference, somebody said, well, I saw the House budget and it was actually pretty good. And I guess it depends on what you compare it to. The House of Representatives budget is pretty good compared to the president's budget, but if you compare it to a budget from any year previously, especially 2010, it's pretty horrible, right? So the budget situation is bleak. It's foreboding, it's kind of scary. But don't worry, we have plenty of reasons to be hopeful. All right, so HUD cuts matter everywhere. Affordable Housing Online created a really great tool so you can calculate from the president's budget what cuts would look like in your community. In Dane County, it would be a loss of $7 million for housing and community development if the budget passes as the president has proposed it. And you can take a look at any number of line items that are going to be in the president's budget or the president's budget proposal. But as you know, the president's budget isn't the final budget. It has to go through the House and the Senate. And so far the House has passed their budget through the Appropriations Committee, and it'll go through a full vote sometime pretty soon, perhaps after the recess. We expect to see the Senate's budget next week. So what I'm going to do right now, for those of you who I imagine are interested and have some sort of involvement and stake in HUD housing programs, is go through some of the programs and talk about what the cuts are in the president's budget and the House budget. I am going to do this fast, so you have all the information, but don't worry, it's all online. And if you grab the handouts, one of the key handouts is the federal budget chart that shows what's in the president's budget for each program, what's in the House budget, and what the budget was approved for the previous years, okay? All right, HUD Budget Outlook is pretty bad. It's under what are the Budget Control Act caps. Some of you might remember the Budget Control Act of 2010 was the idea that for every dollar that's cut out of non-defense spending, we cut a dollar out of defense spending as well. And for the most part, Republicans really want to keep to those caps, but only for non-defense spending. The budget bill that the House Republicans passed just days ago lays out a blueprint for the next 10 years that increases defense spending by $1.6 trillion. And decreases non-defense spending by $1.2 trillion, okay? Now, under the Budget Control Act, we've seen severe cuts, but because of effective advocacy by people throughout the country and people like the people in this room, housing assistance programs, specifically Section 8 vouchers, public housing, project-based rental assistance, have actually been cut less than a lot of the other non-defense discretionary programs. This is a great chart that the Center on Budget and Policy Center, Private Policy Priorities, put together, and it shows that our effective advocacy has been what has been effectively protecting these programs since 2010. Public housing and block grants are getting the deepest cuts. If you look at, since 2010, the drop in public housing, CDBG, home, Section 202 and 811, Native American housing authorities, housing choice vouchers, the only things that have been ticking up are project-based rental assistance, Section 521, and homeless assistance. Does anybody have an idea why project-based rental assistance would be the only thing increasing in its budget?
Goes to private landlords?
That is correct, sir. Project-based rental assistance is the same as public housing, except it's owned by a private entity. Private entities like, for example, our very president, who owns a building that's funded by project-based rental assistance, right? So there's a moneyed interest in keeping PBRA afloat. And you can see the difference between public housing, where the only people advocating for it are the people who rent in public housing and the people who are directors of those agencies, and PBRA. Now, Rob was probably aware that I should point out that one of the reasons project-based rental assistance is increasing in funding is because we're taking public housing and converting it to private ownership. There's a program called Rental Assistance Demonstration, which is effectively the privatization of public housing, and we take money from public housing and put it into PBRA to achieve that. Overall non-defense spending, I think if any of you followed the last election, there was a lot of talk about the deficit and the debt and how we have to be more fiscally responsible. Non-defense appropriations have been dropping consistently, and if we made this chart going back to the 70s, it would look even more extreme. Non-defense programs have been cut and cut and cut again, and the level in 2010 is basically a brief spike that happened as part of sort of the bailout and some other budget increases. So the budget for housing vouchers, the president proposed $17.6 billion, which would mean 250,000 households would lose their voucher. The House of Representatives saved the day with $18.7 billion, and that just means 140,000 households are likely to lose their housing and be at extreme risk of homelessness. HUD estimates that in order to renew all current vouchers, what they need is $19.9 billion, right? And that's because every year the voucher program gets more expensive. Why? Because it pays private landlords who increase their rents, and vouchers always will get more expensive.
Can I just ask a question?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Do you know the nature of Seco Terrace? Is that a private owner?
I don't, actually, but I can look it up very easily.
Because it's...
I believe it's private.
So we will lose it in this budget?
I can't say that.
Would you lose your vouchers?
It's a Section 8 building, so
it's
it comes with the building?
Yeah, so it's project-based rental assistance. Project-based rental assistance is doing pretty well, and basically all contracts will be renewed. So the way that connects with this slide, though, is project-based rental assistance has to stay affordable for a period of time, depending on the contract, 30 or 50 years usually. If that contract runs out, what happens is when the building goes to market rate housing, everyone gets a voucher when they have to move out and they get displaced. When we're cutting vouchers so severely, that's a real threat, right? At our organization, we put together something called the National Housing Preservation Database. So for each privately owned building, you can track when the affordability expires and what work needs to be done to continue it, right? Project-based rental assistance, I just mentioned, this is insufficient renewal funding. House budget passed with $11.1 billion, but as you can see, the renewal funding needed is about $11.4 billion. So how does the House of Representatives think they're going to come up with that money? Oh, well, it's going to be as the administration works toward a more comprehensive package of rent assistance reforms. So what are rent assistance reforms? A couple of key things. Number one, a $50 minimum rent for everyone, including people who have zero income. So this is preposterous for several reasons. Number one, people who don't have money can't pay a $50 minimum rent. Number two, even if you collect that $50 minimum rent from everyone who isn't already paying 30%, it's not going to be enough money to offset the problems in your budget.
Isn't that already the case?
What's that?
Public housing has the $50 monthly minimum?
No, not at all. I mean, unless it's been implemented on the local level, but I don't even think that would be allowed.
It's a maximum of 25. It's a maximum of 25 and a minimum of 0. And the housing authority can set it where they want it between 0 and 25 for a minimum rent.
Okay, so I was told that CDA housing city is, starts at $50. That's the absolute minimum.
This would be the first nationwide policy on minimum rents.
But the minimum of 25 usually includes your utilities.
It includes utilities.
So you think you're not paying, you're getting 0 on the rent, but you're paying, you have to pay at least 25 on your utilities.
Right.
And there are hardship exemptions that, and processes that need to
So we
be applied, so I don't know how that
No,
is
so
impacted by this.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the other changes is
We paid 30%, it's gonna go up.
it's going to go up to 35% of gross income instead of 30% of adjusted income. Because what you're just talking about, taking out energy costs, taking out healthcare costs, adjusting the income, and then after taking all that out, doing 30%, now it would be 35% before any of that gets taken out. So it goes
What about
up.
medical expenses?
That exception will no longer be included except for what HUD is determining as extreme cases, though that's not defined in the law. But wait, that was just in President Trump's budget proposal. The House actually is not going along with these rent reforms for now. The House of Representatives did not include that in their budget, but they are setting this up for an ongoing fight over the next several years, and it's something that we need to track very diligently. Section 202 and 811, for those of you who don't know, these are programs that are very similar to project-based rental assistance. Section 811 is going to decrease by get an increase of $1 million through the House budget, which is not enough to cover all renewals, whereas Section 202 will get an increase up to $573 million. The reason Section 202 gets a lot of money is because it's for people who are elderly. Section 811 gets a lot less. It's for people with disabilities, right? And so it's always the powerful constituencies in Congress, AARP and organizations like Leading Age that advocate for people who are elderly often do a lot better. Housing opportunities for people with AIDS is going back below even its funding level from 2 years ago. So it's seeing a cut from all the way down to 330 million. But right now it's going to be flat funded in the House budget. So the president brings it down to 330. House budget flat funds it. And one of the final points I'm going to make before I turn it over, because I realize I'm kind of just throwing out a lot of numbers again, they're in your handouts, is that flat funding is always a cut. Every program gets more expensive each year to operate. Flat funding doesn't mean, well, we're going to maintain. We're going to be able to continue to serve the same number of people. If you're flat funded, it's always a cut. What am I missing so far? I'm going to really quickly talk about public housing. The operating fund, which pays for actually making sure that we have enough money to keep the buildings running, keep everybody in their units. President Trump proposed cutting it by $500 million, 11% lower than current levels. And the House budget is flat funding it at $4.4 billion. Again, flat funding is a cut. But the real fun story here is the Public Housing Capital Fund, which pays for building improvements, maintenance, and repairs. President Trump proposed reducing it by 68%. Because apparently public housing is doing just fine and doesn't need any repairs. I hope everyone saw when Ben Carson was doing his tour of HUD properties in Miami, he got stuck in an elevator that was broken, so he got a little bit of taste of the importance of the capital fund. The maintenance backlog in 2010 was $26 billion, and it accrues $3.4 billion every year. Because of course, fixing something late costs more. I think everyone in here knows the difference between paying for an oil change now and putting a new engine in your car 6 months from now, right? Because of this, we are losing 10,000 units of public housing each year. Units that could be rented to people if they were fixed and repaired and turned over, sit vacant and empty. A lot of communities like where I live in DC are putting local dollars to their housing authority so that they can bring back a lot of these units that are currently not usable. All right, National Housing Trust Fund, really quickly, President Trump proposed eliminating it. The House is protecting it. The National Housing Trust Fund has gotten 1 year of funding. For right now, it looks like that's going to be stable moving forward. The Home Investment Partnerships Program, which community nonprofits throughout Madison use to build the new housing and to also help low-income and middle-income people become homeowners. President Trump proposed eliminating that program. The House budget cut it by 12%, $100 million. And then Community Development Block Grant, I think I actually have on the next slide, is also being cut in the House by $100 million. The president also tried to zero it out and cut it entirely. Community development block grant is loved by communities because it pays for not just housing, it pays for parks, libraries, roads, a lot of infrastructure improvements, and that is a block grant that's going away. $100 million is what they cut from the House, just like in the home program. Apparently $100 million is the amount that nobody will notice. I don't know exactly how they decide on that number. Legal Services Corporation, I think many of you have heard of the very, very popular book, Evicted, which studied evictions in Milwaukee. If you read that book or if you know about it, you know that very often the best resource for low-income people being evicted to access an attorney is a Legal Services Corporation funded legal aid or legal actions office. President Trump proposed eliminating this entirely, of course, and in the House budget, they give it a 20% cut down to $300 million at a time when evictions are a veritable epidemic and we need to be investing more and more into Legal Services Corporation. Homeless assistance grants receive flat funding in the House budget. President Trump proposed a funding level of $2.25 billion, which was a $383 million cut. Again, flat funding is a cut, but that's where it is in the budget. I have a slide that says questions, but that's a lie. I'm actually going to just turn it over to the next presenter. And then I'll be around to answer any questions that people have. You can go ahead with one right now, sure.
Okay, is the Senate reconciliation with the budget, or is it the 60?
Wow, great question. So the Senate, we don't know what the Senate has released yet. We're expecting to see their budget for the first time this upcoming week before they go on recess. The Senate bill, we expect, will be better than the House bill. And the final bill will be some reconciliation between what the House passes and what the Senate passes. What is in that final reconciliation bill requires very heavily your action so that you're influencing your members of Congress. And I'm not just saying influence Ron Johnson because he's a Republican and he doesn't agree with, housing programs. I'm saying even for people who we know are supportive of our priorities, like Senator Baldwin and Representative Pocan, they have 25 different issues that they're juggling. They're hearing from people about the environment and about healthcare and about education, and all of those things are extremely important, but they better be hearing about affordable housing also, okay? So that's just sort of the lay of the land of what's in these budgets and why we're doing this National Housing League of Action.